All right, good evening. So we're going to deal with Parashat Vayeitzei. That's found in Genesis 28, verse 10. I read it in English and then in Hebrew. And Jacob departed from Beersheba and went to Haran. I really should read the next verse as well, but I think when we get to it, we'll get to it shortly. So we'll deal with it then. Vayeitzei Yaakov mi Beersheba v'yelech Harana. Okay, now Rashi, interestingly enough, says you didn't need to say all these words. You could have just said Yaakov went to Haran. Why does it need to say? Why did the verse have to add? And he went out of Beersheba. So, I mean, it could have. Rashi says it could have. Ella, and he quotes the Midrash, Ella magid yetziat tzaddik min makom osei roshem. This is a famous concept. It's coming to tell you that when a tzaddik leaves a place, from a place, he leaves behind, he created some kind of impression, some kind of, as he's leaving, or the fact that he was there for so long, then he's leaving, there is an impression that was made as he's leaving, or because he has left, or because he was there. We'll have to figure that out, what that means. But this is a famous concept. You just can imagine, like a tzaddik comes to town and all the flowers start blossoming, right? The tzaddik leaves and then the flowers wither away. That's assuming he's the only tzaddik there. So the Kli Yakar wants us to really contemplate, to think about this a second. Yesh YIBONEH. One should really contemplate this. Why? Well, first of all, we know that Avraham and Yitzchak, they must have gone from place to place, and it doesn't mention anything about them leaving. V'chi Avraham v'Yitzchak lo halchu mimakom lemakom. It's a rhetorical question. What? We didn't know? It's not known. We already know that Avraham and Yitzchak, they also went from place to place. Lama lo nichtav etzlam lashon yitziyah. If such a concept exists, and we know that they were tzaddikim, how come when they went from place to place, the Torah didn't let us know earlier on that such a concept exists, that when a holy person leaves from a place, he leaves an impression? Why did the Torah wait until Yaakov to tell us this? And if it's true that it's supposed to happen by any tzaddik, so why didn't the Torah tell us? Why we don't know that it happened at all by Abraham and Yitzchak? You got the question? Clear? So he starts by saying there's different aspects, different ways to look at it. V'yesh panim lekan ulekan. There are perhaps more than one way to glance and view what we're dealing with here and how to answer the question. Kilufum rihata. At a quick glance, in a quick pace, we'll just sum it up here. Part of the question, part of the answer. The Rabuta Nakat Kan Vayeitzei, that the reason here it included the mentioning here of Vayeitzei, that Yaakov left, was because Ki Avraham v'Yitzchak lo hinichu b'makom shahalchu misham tzadik hamotam. When Avraham and Yitzchak left from a place, they didn't leave behind anyone else, any other tzaddik like them. In other words, who went with them? Their whole families. So pshita shitziatam osam. Actually, it didn't say that yet, but pshita shitziatam oso reshem. Obviously, it's so obvious they went from place to place, but they didn't leave behind any other righteous people. So their leaving obviously left an impression. About Khan, but here, and I'll just stress that again, he will mention it. When they left, they took their wives, their children, their cattle, everything with them. But Aval Khan, but here in our verse, we know that Yitzchak and Rivka nisharu sham. There were tzaddikim left behind. Sal k'daita chamina, so you might have thought mistakenly. She'en yitziyah to osa roshem, so you might have thought because there were tzaddikim left behind, that of course it didn't make an impression, because only when there's nothing, right, no righteous people left behind, that one person. Okay, let's get like this. You might have thought if there were people left behind, you would not have made an impression because there's righteous people there. Of course the flowers are going to still be blossoming, as I mentioned. But no, the fact that with one tzaddik leaving behind other tzaddikim, it doesn't matter. There's still an impression made. V'dugma lezeh masik b'rabati. And an example to this was mentioned and brought and quoted in the Medrash, Shemei v'sham raya min, and the Medrash brings a proof from, ready for this? From Naomi, Shetesei min hamakom, that she was going to leave and go back home to Israel from the plains of Moab, that it was mentioned by Ruth. You can find that verse in Ruth number 1, chapter 1, verse 7. So you see that the word Vayeitzei, the concept of leaving a place, is mentioned by her. But you can easily ask from there, that's nichad d'tman. That rests well according to the opinion, the person that said. Lo hayasakim oso tzodeket bilvat. It wasn't only that one person who was righteous, meaning Naomi. There was Ruth. There may have been other people as well. We'll talk about that in a second. Ella hacha da havat Yitzhak v'Rivka. Avahacha, but here you had Yitzhak and Rivka. So you have two people here, as opposed to the quote, as opposed to the example by Ruth. By Naomi leaving, you still had Ruth behind. But we say here, Rabbi Azariah Omer. This is a quote from the Gemara. Eino doim schuta shel tzadik echad l'shnei tzadikim ad kan lashana. He basically is saying that you don't have a comparison. You cannot compare the merit, the advantages, or the credit that is left by one person or is incurred by one person to the credit or advantage of merits that is incurred by several tzaddikim. Meaning that you needed to learn it out by Ruth as well. So you have it by Yaakov. He left behind two tzaddikim, meaning his parents. That would be Yitzhak and Rivka. Whereas in Ruth it had to be mentioned as well because Naomi left, and who did she leave behind? She left behind Ruth, and you couldn't learn one from the other. You needed to learn both. Okay. He says, Yesh lefaresh leidach gisa, which means now we're going to explain the other side. Remember, originally he said these words of v'yesh panim lekan ulekan. There's different aspects, different ways to look at it. So now we're going to shelf the opinion, whatever we just said now, and we're going to look at it a little bit differently. Not much, but it's a little bit of a twist. Shadafka yitziato shel Yaakov v'Yisai reshem, that it was specifically the leaving, the departing of Jacob that made the impression. Avolo yitziat Avram v'Yitzhak. What was the original question? How can we only have, by the third of the forefathers, this concept of a Yitzhak that we learn out, that a righteous person who leaves in a place leaves an impression. If he departed, an impression is left behind. Why didn't we learn it earlier? Remember, they left, they took their whole tribe, they took whoever was with them, their wives, their children, their cattle. Every time they moved from place to place, okay, Avalo Yitzit, okay, I'm sorry, V'lo nishar b'makom shum tzadik. When they left, they didn't leave behind any other righteous people. Al kein lo asu shrosham b'yitziatam. Therefore, no impression was made upon their departure when they exited the city or whatever encampment they were in. Kirushayim shenisharu shama. Any evil people that remain there, ena makpidim al yitziat tzadikim. They're not so concerned when a righteous person leaves. V'yadarabba, in fact, quite the opposite. Heim smeichim b'tzeitam mehem. They're quite overjoyed by their pious neighbors leaving the area. Because they're not really interested. They're not walking in their footsteps. They're not interested in having a mentor or a role model around. In fact, they actually were considered a thorn in their eyes, or they mocked their righteous behavior. It wasn't exactly a good shidduch for these kind of neighbors to be around. Avor ma'asehem. In fact, they quarreled with them on account of their, I'll use the word good behavior, right? The Rishonim, the evil people, didn't really appreciate these good role models around. But if one leaves, he goes away from a place where tzaddikim are found, then what happens to the tzaddikim that are left? Well, first of all, yitziato roishem. That's when an impression is going to be made, when there are tzaddikim there being left behind. Ki hatzaddikim shenisharu kasholeim pridato. Because those righteous people that are being left behind, it's difficult, there's some kind of a difficulty upon them regarding this departure, separation from these righteous people who are leaving town. Ki datam noichem imenu. Since their minds become rested or calmed, right? Yeah, just like misery loves company, the opposite is true. People who are trying to live a Torah lifestyle, an observant lifestyle, living, immoral lifestyle, would appreciate and do appreciate the comfort that other people who are living the same lifestyle afford them. And that's probably why, Judaism is a very community-oriented lifestyle and religion. And we get back to this other principle. It's almost the same concept we had before, where we said you can't compare the schut of one tzaddik to the schut of many tzaddikim. It's the same thing. You couldn't have learned one from the other. In our case, by Yaakov, when he left, there was left behind his parents, Yitzhak and Rivka. Therefore, the impression that was when he left, when he departed, was obvious, was somehow recognizable. And that because of this, we need to say that even when Naomi intended to leave and go the plains of Moab, that she left behind she didn't really leave behind Ruth because she followed her, but at the moment she was about to leave Ruth behind, that there were other righteous Gentiles in that area that also were pained by Naomi's departure. Okay? Davar acher is an alternative explanation. Lechach hizkir kan lashon yitzia ubemakom acher. We have by Avraham. I'll explain in a second. So therefore, we have mentioned here the language of leaving, but we're questioning, one second. In another place by Avraham, if you look in Genesis 12, verse 10, it doesn't use the language of Yitzhak, as we already mentioned, but what language is used? V'yered Avram Mitzrayma. That when Avram departed from Eretz Yisrael, where did he go? He went to Egypt, but it doesn't say that he left, it says that he went down to Egypt. Since Eretz Yisrael is the place for the revelation of the divine presence, holy be He, when you go out from the land of Israel, you go down, you descend. It was a descension for him. It was like a dropping of levels of spirituality, shall we say, or of the connection that he had. V'yetzia min kav hashivoi. Very interesting, very poetic language here, that he was leaving his line of balance, or his equilibrium. Do you understand? Leaving Eretz Yisrael is like leaving your essence, where you find yourself, where you have balance in your life. Kikol yetziahu min hamakom shu roi liyot bo. And that's true by any leaving from a place, from the place where you're most fitting and appropriate to be, which obviously for a Jew, it's Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, and for a fish, that would be the water. And lahavdil, fish, but we're going to talk about God in a second. What did God say in Exodus 11, verse 4? He says, Ani yotzei mitoch Mitzrayim. Right, during the plagues, last plague, I am going out into the midst of Egypt, So that means God also left his equilibrium. God also left his comfort zone. He left the place that's most fitting for him to be. So nimser shiyitzia zu osta roshim gambo ba'atzmo. That the impression that God left when he came down, so to speak, into this world, into Egypt. You think he wanted to go to Egypt? I mean, who wants to go to Egypt? So when he left his makom, his special place, he left an impression within himself. Can you imagine? He loves the Jewish people so much. He mamish came and went to Mitzrayim, and he left an impression within himself. Okay, that's a heavy one to get your head around.
He left an impression within himself.
Ubiyokud masik, and the Midrash mentions, this is really cool what he's about to say. Yesh shezivug, Yesh shezivugo hoylech elav, yesh hoylech etzel zivugo. Sometimes, right, your soulmate comes to you, and sometimes you go to your soulmate. We all know that, right? Sometimes, right, you're surprised that one of the two partners is being, we'll call it, not in a negative sense, taking the initiative, maybe being aggressive, calling, making sure that that this is going to happen. So sometimes it's the other way around. Yaakov halach eitzel zivugo. Here we're talking about Yaakov going to Haran. For what purpose? He wanted to find his wife. Shneimar, as it says, Vayeitzei Yaakov mi Beersheva. That's our verse. We said we didn't need all that, right? Just enough to say that Yaakov went to Haran. Yaakov departed. There's a Vayeitzei, Yaakov departed. Ech laman mi pasuk ze shahalech etzel zivugo bivarchu mimnei Esav. How are we supposed to learn from this verse that Yaakov went on the way to find his soulmate when we all know he was really just running away from Esav? Esav wanted to kill him. He was so upset about this birthright. Ein ze ki'im kushya. Well, first of all, this is not the only question. Vayeitzei Yaakov. We just got done saying in this medrash that there's a concept of holech. Holech means going in a forward direction. Right? You're looking forward, and that's where you want to go. Vayeitzei is departing. I'm not saying you're turning around looking from where you're departing from, but departing is more connected to the place you just came from, and holech is more connected to the place you're going to. So it should have said v'yelech miboile. If he's going, as the Midrash says, he's going to find his zivug, he's going to find his soulmate. Shouldn't the pasuk have said what the Midrash intends for it to say? It doesn't. It says Yaakov departed. It should have said Yaakov went forward to find his zivug. Hichricho loimer sheYaakov ha'imesalek machshavto mikol v'kol. We're forced to say that Yaakov had removed from his mind or his thoughts everything. It was entirely removed from his thoughts from the place of his parents' dwelling, from his parents' household. Al kenikra yotzei. That's why it says he went out as opposed to he went forward. That he had like an entire departure. He left his parents, and that was it. Actually, when you talk about it in the sense that you're departing entirely, that comes to include someone who travels to some place towards something with intent to actually return. If you're telling me he went out, that means he had no intent to return. Because then if he had intent to return, what happens? Then he's always thinking and wandering about the place. Even though he's going somewhere else, he's thinking back about the place which he had left from. In other words, while he's still in the place that he's at, where he went to, he's still thinking about the old place. That's called traveling forward and not departing. We said departing is like a clear cut, right? And holech is going like a traveler. They always think about going home at some point. In fact, they call it homesick when people, maybe when you're young, or maybe when you're in love, maybe you have lots of family, you're always thinking about home. Ki lo yatsa mikol v'kol. You didn't depart entirely. You just are traveling, and you know where your destination is really the place you left from. Sharei adayin machshavto shama. That your thoughts are always and are still there. Al ken kasha l'bal medrash zeh. Therefore, this is really a difficulty to the author of this medrash. Why? Ki mi hitir li Yaakov la'azov avi ve'imo mikol v'kol. Who actually gave permission to Jacob to leave behind his parents entirely? Al zamar mikimataretz. Therefore, we can come up with as an answer lefish halach etzel zivugo. That's what we mean, that he went to find his soulmate. How do we know? The pasuk says in Genesis 2, verse 24, Al kain yazov ish es aviv es imo v'dabach b'ishto. Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and cling to his wife, and they shall be as one flesh. So we do get this idea that what? That's what a man's job is to do in this life. After he's, grown up, he has to leave his parents' home, he has to leave their presence, and find his wife. And yes, to be Vayeitzei. In other words, how do we know that Vayeitzei doesn't just mean that he's going and coming back, but rather that he's going out to find his zivug, because that's what the tafki, that's what ultimately the man has to do. I know it's sad for a lot of mothers, it's very difficult, and I'm sure it's just as difficult on the men as well. Davar acher, alternatively, lefi shemitzina sheyakov ne'ena shalosim kape shana elokiyim mitzvahs kibbutz aveim. We find that Yaakov was actually punished for those 22 years that he did not fulfill the command to honor one's father and mother. Right? He was away for 22 years. Yesh lahakshos, you can ask, 1 second. Halo alach berushuto, ivo v'imo mitzvotehem. I kind of sort of remember that he was given permission. Right? Wasn't he given permission by his own parents according to their command? Why was he punished? Why should he have been punished for all those 22 years?
Because he didn't call, he didn't write.
Yeah, he didn't send the pigeon. That even if you find to say that he would have transgressed about what his mother said. What did his mother say to him? You can find this in Genesis chapter 27, verse 44. V'yashavta imo yamim achidim. That she said, and dwell with him for a few days until your brother's wrath subsides. This was what she said to her son as he was departing. She was getting him, all bundled up to go. And she said, go, but it does say yamim achidim. What is yamim achidim? A few days. So, okay, but he was punished for 22 years. So maybe he should only have been punished for 21 years and 300 and some days. But he was punished for 22 years, which, okay, so that means he was punished the whole time. So nevertheless, we see that he was punished for the whole amount of time, and he didn't transgress with his mother. Well, even if you want to say he transgressed, if we want to understand, Yamim Achidim is just a few years. But, remember what his father said to him? Look up chapter 28, verse 2. This is just a little bit ahead. Earlier, sorry. It says, Kum lek padana aram. Right? Yitzhak said, arise, get up to Padan Aram in order to take a wife. So he did go with permission. Hitir lo lelech. Right? Yitzhak gave him permission to go. Aval, what did he not give him permission to do? Lo letzeit mikol v'kol. not to forget about his parents, not to divorce them, not to get them out of his mind. Because we said anybody that goes, we're talking about the forward direction, was with intent to return. Oh, Shadayin, Machshavto, Mishotetet Shama, or that still his thoughts were wandering there, Nikra Hoylech V'lo Yotzei. Then it would have been called Hoylech and not Yotzei, but we see the pasuk says Yotzei. V'hu lo kenosah, but he didn't do the Holech, he did the Yotzei. Ella, the pasuk says Vayeitzei Yaakov mikol v'kol. Yaakov was Yotzei, he went out, meaning a clean departure without looking back. Ki'ilu shachach es beis avi v'imo. It's as if he no longer thought about his parents, which is why he was punished. Al kenenash kiyotzebo could be kiyotzebo. Therefore, he was punished for this concept that he departed. Okay, now shebein echad mibanov hu Yosef, the son of one of his sons. Well, we're talking about Yosef being one of Yitzchak's sons. This is one of Jacob's sons. Lo kibdo kapet shana. He did not honor his father, meaning Yaakov, for 22 years because he was sold and in Mitzrayim. Lo zocher ben Yosef v'yishkachehu. And Yosef did not remember his father. In other words, we say mida keneged mida. Punishment is measure for measure. And just like Yaakov did not call, write, email, text, send a pigeon home, and wish his parents happy birthday every year or anniversary, so too, Yosef also didn't remember his father and didn't involve, he was away from his father for 22 years. Now it says later on, Genesis 41, verse 51, when he named Menashe, Ki Nishani Elohim es kol amali ve'et kol beis avi. It says, Jacob called the name of the firstborn Menashe, for God has made me forget all the hardships of my father's household. Ve'yada Yosef ki me'et Hashem hayosazot. Yosef knew this forgetting came from God. He tried to remember his father. He tried. In fact, when he was running away from Potiphar's wife, even the image of his father came up for a second. But he couldn't muster up all the time that he was there for those 22 years. Al Kain Amar Nishani Elohim. That's why he was able to say, God made me. God caused me to forget. Avahu bitzkato haylo cheshech v'ratzon lioslo bat Beit Aviv, Tamid, but from his own side, from his own righteousness, from within him, he wanted the desire. He really wanted to be at his father's side constantly and to remember the Zicharon Neged Einav, and to have his remembrance, the cognizant of his father in front of him, but always, V'lo Yachol, he just wasn't able to because God caused him forget. Ki nishahu Elohim. Okay, we're going to end here. 1 second.